Welcome to the ARC workshop on the ATI TEAS test language section. So we're going to talk a bit about the types of questions that you're likely to see on the ATI TEAS test in the language section. And then once we've gone over the types of questions, we will go over some examples of each type and how you might want to approach them. So the questions that you're likely to see in the language section include questions about spelling, punctuation, sentence structure, vocabulary, formal versus informal language, and the writing process. So some of these, especially the specifics of, say, punctuation or sentence structure, you're not likely to have seen in a classroom for a while, which is why we're going over how you can best approach these questions without having to reinvent the wheel. So the spelling questions in the language section are going to ask which sentence uses the correct word, if a word is spelled correctly, or for the correctly spelled version of a word. For the most part, this means that you're just going to need to memorize the correct spelling of relevant words. However, you can also approach these questions by becoming more familiar with spelling rules and conventions. The punctuation questions are going to ask which version of a sentence uses punctuation correctly, or for the proper punctuation to include in a certain sentence. So that means you want to be familiar with the rules and conventions for things like commas, periods, semicolons, and other common punctuation marks. Sentence structure questions are going to ask what type of clause a part of a sentence is, what part of speech a word in a sentence is, or what type of sentence structure a sentence follows. So for this, you probably don't talk often about the types of clauses that you use in your sentences. So you will want to brush up on the parts of speech and the types of sentences and clauses that you might be asked about. Vocab questions are going to ask for the meaning of a word, often a word that will be used in a medical setting, but not always. In addition to memorizing a lot of vocabulary, you can prepare for these questions by studying lists of common root words, prefixes, and suffixes. That way you can more easily determine the meaning of a word that you're not familiar with. And you can approach questions also by making sure to look at the context clues in the sentence, which might give you a hint as to what the meaning of the word should be. Some of the questions in the language section are going to ask you about formal versus informal language. So these questions are going to ask you to identify which sentence best belongs in a formal or informal setting. A formal setting might be something like an employee handbook. An informal setting might be something like a personal conversation. It's best to approach these questions by looking at the vocabulary that's used, whether or not there are contractions. If there are, that indicates more informal language. If there aren't, more formal. And just how the speaker seems to be addressing the audience. And lastly, there are going to be some writing process questions. So these are going to ask you about various parts of the writing process. For example, what sentence should include a citation, whether or not a sentence belongs in a paragraph, things like that. You want to keep in mind proper citation rules. For example, anything that seems to have a source should have a citation. And you also want to make sure that every sentence in a paragraph follows the same topic, and look out for transition sentences. So overall, things that you want to brush up on for the language section include sentence structure and parts of a sentence, common homonyms, that's words that sound the same but have different meanings, so things like there, and there. General punctuation rules, especially around commas, and you want to expand your knowledge of prefixes, suffixes, and root words for the vocab section. These are the pieces of test prep that you largely just need to study and memorize. Strategy won't necessarily help you with them. So next we're going to go over some example questions. for each of these types. So in this example question about sentence structure, we have the sentence, although Senator Jones is now obsessed with budgetary deficits, when he was in power, he saw nothing wrong with running a large deficit. So the question asks, which of the following statements is true? A, although Senator Jones is now obsessed with power is an independent clause, and B, although Senator Jones is now obsessed with power is a dependent clause. The way we can identify whether or not it's an independent clause or a dependent clause is whether or not the piece of the sentence can stand on its own. So if you just say, although Senator Jones is now obsessed with power by itself, or is now obsessed with budgetary deficits by itself, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. We have this hanging although, but it doesn't seem to compare to anything. So that will indicate to us that that is a dependent clause. Whereas the other part of the sentence, when he was in power, he saw nothing wrong with running a large deficit, does stand on its own and does make sense by itself, in which case is an independent clause. So for this question, we know that although Senator Jones is now obsessed is a dependent clause because of this although piece that makes it making sense hinge on the rest of the sentence also being there. So some strategies for sentence structure questions are to brush up on the parts that make up a sentence, memorize some different sentence types, memorize different parts of speech. So sentence types would be things like, is it an interrogative sentence, like a question, things like that. And parts of speech are things like nouns, adjectives, that sort of thing. So if you don't remember off the top of your head any of what those words mean, you probably want to go ahead and brush up on those. You always want to remember that an independent clause can stand as its own sentence, while a dependent clause cannot. And remember, you do know how a sentence works already, but you do need to memorize the terminology to describe it. So even if you go into this thinking, yes, I know how to structure a sentence, you probably want to brush up on the specific grammar terminology used on the test before you take it. So here we have an example of a question that involves homonyms. So words that sound the same but are spelled and mean different things. So it's simply asking which sentence is correct. We've got A, each device was rechargeable except for the toy car. B, each device was rechargeable except for the toy car, and we've got a different except here. C, each device was rechargeable except for the toy car with A except. And D, each device was rechargeable except with an E for the toy car. So the first thing we can do is look at the word device and defies. So while they sound very similar, we can note that defies is actually a verb and device is the noun. So this would be talking about the object that could be rechargeable, and this is just a similar sounding word that is spelled different and means something different. So we can eliminate these last two. So now we've got the question between except with an A and except with an E. And this is one of those things that you just have to memorize. But if we've memorized it, then we know that except with an A is a verb that means to accept something, like accept something in the mail, whereas accept with an E means to have an exception. And also you could look a little bit at the etymology. For example, the EX here usually means, it's a negative, like pushing something away from you. So an exception, an exemption, things like that. So since this is a toy that is being set apart, you could also guess from that it would be except with an E. And we're left with our correct answer. So some study strategies for this type of question include making flashcards if you know you have trouble with homonyms. You could make flashcards with different ones of them to memorize which ones are which. Test prep books like the ATI TEAS Crash Course book, which is available from the John Tyler Library, also have lists of common homonyms such as there, and there. And TEAS books in particular may have more medical field specific homonyms that you might want to familiarize yourself with before the test. So here we have an example question on punctuation. So the question asks, which sentence is punctuated correctly? We have A, Dave, comma, an insightful and talented therapist, comma, is nevertheless prone to jumping to conclusions. We have B, Dave is an insightful and talented therapist, but, comma, he is nevertheless prone to jumping to conclusions. C, although Dave, comma, is an insightful and talented therapist, comma, he is nevertheless prone to jumping to conclusions. And D, Dave, an insightful and talented therapist, comma, is nevertheless prone to jumping to conclusions. So all of these sentences have basically the same meaning, but one of them is punctuated best for clearest understanding. So one way I like to think of this is if a phrase is offset by commas, meaning there's a comma at the beginning and end of it, it usually means that it's something you could take out of the sentence and still have the sentence make sense. So if we try that with A, that leaves us with Dave is nevertheless prone to jumping to conclusions. And that mostly makes sense. If we do it with the second sentence, we can't because there's nothing offset by commas. And if we do it with the third sentence, we have, although Dave, he is nevertheless prone to jumping to conclusions. And that doesn't really make sense. So we can get rid of that one already because it has something offset by commas, but that doesn't quite work because it offsets something that is actually an integral part of the sentence. For option B, we know that usually a comma is going to go before words like and or but, which means that one's incorrect. And for D, we have Dave is an insightful and talented therapist, comma, is nevertheless prone to jumping to conclusions. And we don't usually want to have a comma before a word like is, because it makes it really unclear who this is referring to. So that leaves us with option A, Dave, comma, an insightful and talented therapist, comma, is nevertheless prone to jumping to conclusions. Some study strategies for punctuation questions include memorizing categorical rules, such as periods are used at the end of sentences and for abbreviations. Commas are used to separate items in a list after an introductory word group or before a conjunction, such as, and, so, but, for, etc. Two commas may mark an interruption in the sentence. So like I was saying before, if you have two commas that offset something, it might be an interruption, but that doesn't really disrupt the meaning of the sentence. It just adds on to it. And lastly, apostrophes show possession or mark missing letters in a contraction. Okay, so now we're going to look at some strategies that include process of elimination. So that's marking off answers that you know won't work until you're left with one or at least two that you're pretty sure would work. Etymology, which is things like suffixes and prefixes that will help you determine the meaning of a word. and underlining keywords. So for the process of elimination, we have the question, which of the following is the meaning of the word robust as used in this sentence? The coffee they serve in Turkey is so robust, I don't think I slept more than 3 hours any of the nights I stayed there. So using the process of elimination, we can try just inputting each of these words into this sentence and see if they make sense. And we can do that using the context clues. So if we try, the coffee they serve in Turkey is so strong, I don't think I slept more than 3 hours any of the nights I stayed there. That makes sense. Strong coffee would keep you awake. If we do, the coffee they serve in Turkey is so watery, I don't think I slept more than 3 hours any of the nights I stayed there. That doesn't really make sense. Watery coffee isn't generally going to keep you awake. If we do, the coffee they serve in Turkey is so sweet, I don't think I slept more than 3 hours any of the nights I stayed there. That could make sense. Sugar might keep you awake. And then we have D, the coffee they serve in Turkey is so hot, I don't think I slept more than 3 hours any of the nights I stayed there. That one doesn't make as much sense. Hot coffee is not really going to keep you awake. Then we're left if we can eliminate both watery and hot because they don't really make sense in this context. We have strong and sweet. And in general, just going by the context that it has kept the person awake so that they couldn't sleep more than 3 hours, strong coffee is probably going to keep you awake much more than sweet coffee. So having eliminated all of our other options, that leaves us with A, strong. Now we have some practice for the etymology strategy. So the question is, based on two parts of the word polysemy, which of the following definitions is correct? A, having several meanings, B, having several forms, C, having one husband or wife, or D, having one color. So if we look at the word polysemy, we can break it down into two pieces. At least we've got the beginning poly, and then we've got semi. So generally we know that poly means many. That would come up in polygon, many sides, or polygamy, married to multiple people. So in general, we can look at this list and say that having several meanings or several forms makes more sense than having one because poly means many. So we can eliminate these last two. And then we've got the question between meanings and forms. And sem, this is probably a lesser known piece of etymology. But if we brush up on it, or if we just think of words that sound similar, we could come to semantics or things like that. So sem is Greek for sign or meaning. So having several meanings makes the most sense here, just based on the pieces of the word that we can break down. But even if we only get so far as the poly piece, we've already eliminated two of the answers, which leaves you with a much better chance of picking the correct one, even if you just guess at this point. And lastly, we've got underlining keywords practice. So which of the following sentences in a research paper should include a citation? So we've got A, asthma symptoms include episodes of wheezing, coughing, chest tightness, and shortness of breath. We've got B, the present paper explores the relationship between asthma and exercising. We've got C, the last World Health Organization report states that asthma may become worse at night or with exercise. And we've got D, this paper concludes asthma symptoms can be lessened with an exercise routine. So in this first sentence, As you can see, we don't have anything underlined because nothing is really indicating that there is a particular source or that we're referencing any paper. So we've just got asthma symptoms include episodes of wheezing, coughing, chest tightness, and shortness of breath. Um, and that's something that might be common knowledge. It's not generally something that a singular source would be needed for. So we can eliminate that one. For B, we've underlined the present paper because you want to look out for anything that is referencing what source the information comes from. So this is saying the present paper explores the relationship between asthma and exercising. Well, this is telling us about a present paper, so the paper that's being written. And you don't need to cite something just to explain what you're going to be writing about. So we can eliminate that. For C, we've got the last World Health Organization report states that asthma may become worse at night or with exercise. And we've underlined states that because we're looking out for any phrase that indicates something that would need to be cited. So anything that says states or says indicates that we're looking at something that came from another source that says it. So this looks like so far a pretty good candidate for needing a citation. And lastly, we've got this paper concludes asthma symptoms can be lessened with an exercise routine. And again, we are referencing a paper, but it looks like we're referencing this paper that we're writing, which means that it's not something that you would need to cite, it's something that you're saying yourself. So that ultimately leaves us with C, the last World Health Organization report states that asthma may become worse at night or with exercise, and that states that we've underlined lets us know that the sentence probably requires a citation. So what you want to look out for when you're underlining things is identify what you're looking for. So we're looking for a sentence that includes a citation, and then think about the situations in which a sentence might include a citation. So if we're referencing an outside source. So you could have also gone through and underlined World Health Organization report because that's something that indicates that it is an outside source as well. So that's been our workshop on the ATI TEAS language section. We hope this has been helpful to you identifying what you might want to brush up on and what you already have a handle on. Definitely take a look at some more practice questions in one of the test prep books or something like that before you actually take the test. And if you'd like to practice more or you think you're having trouble with this section, feel free to come into the ARC during our drop-in hours, which are 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and ask for a writing tutor to jump in a breakout room with you and go over some practice questions or just some concepts that you might be having trouble with. Good luck with the test.